Over the next few episodes, I'm going to take you on a journey into the wonderful world of biblical imagery. And we're going to look at a prophecy in the book of Revelation, chapter 13, that simply cannot be understood correctly without understanding the biblical imagery that it's using. Now, the fact of the matter is that not understanding biblical imagery has led to a very wrong understanding, a very wrong interpretation about the Antichrist and the false prophet as being two separate individuals. And by the time we're done, you're going to see that without any question, that there are not two separate individuals, one being the Antichrist, who's more of a military figure, and the other being the false prophet, being more of a religious figure, because that's the typical way that that's been presented. But there is only one individual who is the Antichrist figure, yet the book of Revelation never calls him the Antichrist by using the name Antichrist, but that the book of Revelation does call that Antichrist figure the false prophet. And what we're going to be talking about is very important because it's addressing a misconception concerning Bible prophecy and the end times that has been spread around the world. And it's a misconception. It's wrong. And yet, the majority of Christians who get into studying end times have adopted this wrong misconception. And so welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Midweek Rapture podcast. And as we get going here on this fascinating subject, we're going to be spending a lot of time in Revelation chapter 13. But before we do, we got to back up to Revelation chapter 12 because the storyline that was happening in Revelation 12 kind of bleeds over into Revelation chapter 13. And so recognizing how the storyline carries over into the next chapter is part of the process of correctly understanding and interpreting what's going on in Revelation chapter 13. And so within the imagery that we see in Revelation chapter 12, it starts out by John seeing a woman who's clothed with the sun, moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. And this woman is pregnant, but she's not only pregnant, she's screaming in labor pains, and she's struggling to give birth. Now, as we go through this, I want you to kind of imagine this. This is imagery, so we have to use our imagination. So she's screaming in labor pains, and then we see another sign appear in heaven, this huge red dragon, and this is the first time the dragon is introduced in the book of Revelation. This dragon has 7 heads and 10 horns. That's important because we kind of see that same imagery in the first verse of the very next chapter, only in a slightly different way. And all of these little details are very important. So this dragon has 10 horns, and on his 7 heads, there are 7 crowns. And so later on, we're going to see a beast that's distinct from the dragon. And the beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. But only in that case, the crowns are not on the heads like we see here in chapter 12, verse 3, but on the horns and not on the heads. And then we see that the dragon's tail sweeps a third part of the stars in heaven and hurls them to the earth. The dragon is angry with the woman who's about to give birth, and all of this is part of the storyline of the gospel. And in future episodes, we're going to really hone in on all of this imagery and explain it in detail so that there's clarity, so that you walk away knowing what all this stuff is referring to. And if the point of studying the book of Revelation is not to get that clarity, then why study it at all? So I'm very big on getting clarity. What is this talking about? And then tracking it down until you get the real true understanding of what was intended. So this woman, she gives birth to a son, the male child. And this male child's going to rule over all the nations. And then her child's caught up to God and to his throne. And there are many misconceptions over who this male child is. There's misconceptions over who the woman is, and we're going to address all that in future episodes as well. But the woman flees into the wilderness. Okay, and the word wilderness there is imagery that's meant to immediately take you back to the Exodus story. When the children of Israel fled Egypt, they went out into the wilderness where they had a place prepared by God for them. But here it says the woman was taken care of for 1,260 days. And so in this storyline, this is something different because it's taking place in the future. And specifically, all of this imagery and the entire entire storyline in Revelation chapter 12 is taking place at the midpoint of the final 7 years. And we know for sure that that's true because of the mention of these 1260 days, which is referring to the final 3.5 years of the final 7 years. And so the woman, whoever she represents, and her being pregnant and having birth pains, whatever that represents, and it's talking about persecution, by the way, and the male child who's being born, whoever he represents, and it's not Jesus, by the way. And the reason is because all of this is taking place at midpoint of the future 7 years. The timing indicator tells us that, and so it becomes concrete. The storyline, the entire storyline of Revelation 12 is set in the future at midpoint of the 7 years. And then something really major happens in verse 7. A war breaks out in heaven, not on the earth, in heaven, between Michael and his angels and the dragon and his angels. Now, in this chapter, we don't know who the dragon is yet, but only a couple of verses later, we find out who the dragon is. It says in verse 9, so that huge dragon, the ancient serpent. Now, just to pause here for a second, the mention of the ancient serpent is intentional, and it's supposed to take you back to the garden. And then it goes on, the one called the devil and Satan. So the imagery of a dragon, we don't even have to guess. That represented Satan. And the stars that the dragon's tail flung to the earth, those are his angels. So we're talking about heavenly beings here. And of course we are, because we're talking about a war that takes place in the heavenly realms. And as a result of this war, that takes place, by the way, at midpoint of the final 7 years, is that Satan and his angels are being cast down, which is representing the taking away of their authority to influence the nations of the world the way that they have, causing the period of time between Adam and the coming of Jesus to be called the present evil age and the valley of the shadow of death. And this war marks the end of this present evil age. That's why there's an announcement in heaven immediately after Satan and his angels are cast down at the midpoint. And this loud voice in heaven says, the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the ruling authority of his Christ have now come. When is now? Now is at midpoint of the final 7 years. That's when the kingdom of God comes. That's when the ruling authority of Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ, comes. Why does it happen at that point? Because the accuser of our brothers and sisters has been thrown down. But then what happens? You see, the story doesn't end there. We're still at midpoint of the final 7 years, and there's more to the story. What happens after Satan and his angels are cast down to the earth? There's more to the story. You see, later on in the book of Revelation, Satan is bound in the bottomless pit for 1,000 years, and the beast and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire. But that's later. That's at the end of the 7 years. There's still an ongoing story with this dragon who's now on the earth and no longer has the authority in the heavenly realms. The situation has changed. The kingdom of God is now here at midpoint, and Jesus is now here at midpoint. And the dragon, it says in verse 13, he realized that he had been thrown down to the earth, and he goes forth to pursue, in another translation it says persecute, but he goes forth to pursue the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a giant eagle so that she could fly out into the wilderness to the place God prepared for her, where she is taken care of, away from the presence of the serpent. Now notice it switches back to the serpent imagery, away from the presence of the serpent for a time times and half a time, which is the final 3.5 years again. And there's a lot more here that we could talk about. And I'm skipping over a lot of things here, but I'm trying to get to Revelation chapter 13 because that's kind of the focus of this episode. But we need to have all of this kind of background in order to get into chapter 13. It all has to be clear. And so when we get to the end of the chapter, in verse 17, it says, "So the dragon became enraged at the woman." Of course, he pursued her, but he can't get to her because she's being protected. So he's mad at the woman, but he can't do anything about the woman. So what does he do? So he goes off to make war on the rest of her children. So she's the one who gave birth to the male child. And everybody thinks the male child is Jesus, but it's not Jesus. Because this whole thing is taking place in the future at midpoint of the 7 years. And this woman, she has more offspring than just the male child. Because this verse says that the dragon goes to make war on the rest of her children. And who are the rest of her children? And this will give you a clue as to who the male child represents as well. The rest of her children are those who keep God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So if the rest of her children are the saints of God who hold to the testimony of Jesus, then the male child represents the same thing, which is those who hold to the testimony of Jesus. I think it's pretty straightforward and simple, but then we get to verse 18, and this chapter ends with just this weird ending. And some of the translations, you'll notice, actually have this as the first verse of chapter 13, and some translations have this as the last verse of chapter 12. But it just says, "And the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore." That's kind of a weird way to end this chapter. But when you realize that that's a transitional statement that carries forward into the content of the next chapter, it makes a whole lot more sense. So we have this scene where this dragon goes forth to make war with the saints of God during the last 3.5 years. And that's essentially what's happening. Satan goes forth to make war on the saints of God who hold the testimony of Jesus. And this war he makes with them is something that happens during the last 3.5 years. It's very important to recognize that. Now, if you've followed my podcast before, you know what this is all talking about. The sixth seal is opened at midpoint of the 7 years, and Jesus appears to the whole world. There's judgment on the nations. Satan and his angels are being cast down, which is what happens under the sixth seal in the imagery of the stars fall to the earth, like unripe figs that are holding on, not willing to let go, but they are forced to let go because they're shaken by a mighty wind. And this is describing the end of the time of the kingdom of darkness influencing the world and the nations, and the time when Jesus and his kingdom take over that place of authority and now begin influencing the world and the nations in righteousness. But even so, when this happens, Satan is not bound in the bottomless pit until the end of the 7 years, and yet the imagery is that he's being cast to the earth, which means he's still here and he's still active, and the activity that he's going to be involved with in the last 3.5 years after he's cast down is going forth to make war on the saints of God who hold the testimony of Jesus. But who are these saints? Because when Jesus comes and he appears to the whole world at midpoint of the 7 years, that's when the resurrection happens, and that's when the rapture happens. Because the rapture and the catching away of the saints, it happens when Jesus appears, and the time when Jesus appears is at midpoint of the 7 years. So if the saints of God who are dead and in the grave are raised and resurrected back to life at midpoint, and then all of the saints of God who are alive at the time of the appearing of Jesus are raptured and caught up together with them at midpoint, then who are the saints that Satan goes to make war with during the last 3.5 years? And as we talked about in the last episode, at the time Jesus appears at midpoint, every eye will see him. All of the people who are on the face of the earth will see Jesus. And the result of that will be a massive inflow of people into the faith. They will believe because they have seen, they will turn from their wicked ways, and they will submit to Jesus. And we know that's the case with the Jews because of passages like we see in Zechariah chapter 12 and 13. But it'll happen more than just with the Jews when they recognize Jesus when he appears. It'll happen worldwide. And so this is a mass conversion event. The people of the world will have to make a choice once they see Jesus, and many of them will make the right choice and become, as it says here in Revelation 12:17, the rest of the woman's children who now hold to the testimony of Jesus. And so all of that backdrop, all of that background leads up to this verse. And the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. It almost seems like it's out of place, but it's not out of place. What is he doing standing on the sand of the seashore? And this is where biblical imagery has to be fully embraced, because we still have the dragon, who we know is Satan, but he's standing on the sand of the seashore. So picture that in your mind for a moment. The dragon is standing on the beach and he's looking out into the sea. Why is he doing that? And it's because he's summoning something out of the sea. And as we move forward, remember that this is happening at midpoint of the 7 years. And then we transition into chapter 13, verse 1, with this image in your mind, imagining the dragon standing on the sand of the seashore, looking out into the sea, summoning something to come out from the sea. And it says, "Then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea." Now, knowing the background of this, that he's going forth to make war with the new saints of God for the last 3.5 years, what he's doing by summoning this beast up out of the sea is all for the purpose of going after the saints of God. Now, chapter 13 talks about two beasts, one that comes up out of the sea in verse 1, and another beast coming up out of the earth in verse 11. And the traditional way that this is presented is that the first beast that comes up out of the sea is the Antichrist, and the second beast that comes up out of the earth is the false prophet. But nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, I'm going to show you that the second beast that comes up out of the earth, that is the Antichrist figure. But this first beast that comes up out of the sea, we need to take a closer look at, because there's more to this than what meets the eye. And we're going to look at this through the lens of biblical imagery until we get clarity, until we see what this is actually talking about. Now, I used to hear something years ago that people would say about this beast coming up out of the sea. And the reason that they say that this is the Antichrist is because the Antichrist is going to come up out of the sea of people. That the sea represents the nations, and therefore the Antichrist is going to come up out of the sea or the nations. But the imagery about this sea that's being described here, there's a whole lot more to it than what most people realize. And so now I'm going to read to you out of the Dictionary of Biblical Imagery. And this is like an encyclopedia that explores images, symbols, motifs, metaphors, figures of speech, and literary patterns of the Bible. And this is very instructive because what it says about the sea and the way the Bible uses the imagery of the sea, it's very, very interesting, but it's absolutely essential to understand this in order to rightly understand what's happening here in Revelation chapter 13 with this beast that's coming up out of the sea. What is that supposed to mean? And so it says, the sea is central to the biblical picture of the universe. Like its ancient neighbors, the Israelites believed that at creation, God used a cosmic sea to create a three-tiered universe: the sea, the heavens, and the earth. God created the cosmic sea and then gathered the waters covering the entire face of the earth into seas and established their boundaries, which rooted the earth in the cosmic sea. Then he formed the firmament to enclose the atmosphere and hold back the sea that was above the firmament. Now the sea provides all the water on the earth. Waters spring forth below, and drops from above, rain and snow, even providing water for the great flood. Now above the heavens, God's throne floats upon the sea. And as a reference for that, you can go to Psalm 29, verse 10. Now listen to this, because here is the point. In this picture, the sea is a tribute to the power of God, the Creator, over chaos, and may have been symbolized by the large bronze molten sea before Solomon's temple. And then even further, it goes on to say this: the cosmic sea, however, also symbolizes the continued threat the forces of chaos pose against God and creation. The sea pushes against the boundaries God established for it. The Bible adapts its neighbors' creation myths of a primeval battle between a creator God and a sea monster of chaos called Leviathan, Rahab, or the dragon, or the serpent, like in Job chapter 41. Unlike the myths of the neighboring nations, God is the one who creates the chaos monster and places it in the sea. The monster stirs the cosmic sea, but is wounded and subdued by God and will ultimately be vanquished in the end times. As the home of the chaos monster who can be roused, the sea symbolizes the threat of the reemergence of chaos. Now notice this. It says, as the home of the chaos monster who can be roused, the sea symbolizes the threat of the reemergence of chaos. In fact, the evil world powers and the Antichrist of the last days, which oppose God and his people, are symbolized as beasts rising up out of the sea. And we're going to look at that reference in just a minute over in Daniel chapter 7. And it goes on to say this: as creator, God controls the sea, both producing and calming its waves, and keeping it within its boundaries. He can dry up the sea at will, or unleash it to judge the world, as in the flood of Noah. Thus, the parting of the Red Sea and the destruction of Pharaoh is a reenactment of the subduing of the sea and chaos monster, once more demonstrating God's ultimate authority over forces of chaos and evil. This same authority is symbolized by Jesus walking on the sea and calming the sea. Even the beast of Revelation which arises from the sea is subdued and cast into the lake of fire. Now, I wanted to read that to you because I want you to notice that in Revelation 13 verse 1, when it says, "Then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea," that the imagery that this represents is massive. And the picture that we're getting here is that the dragon who's standing on the seashore, who's looking out over the sea, and he's like waiting for this beast to come up. He's waiting, or maybe even summoning this beast to come up out of the sea. That this beast that's coming up out of the sea represents chaos and turmoil. And as we saw in the previous verses, the purpose for it is because he's going to use this beast that comes up out of the sea to make war with all of the people who are now submitting their lives to Jesus because of his appearing. And he's furious about that. And he's going to go forth to try and put a stop to it. But what is it that's coming up out of the sea? This is a beast. And now, what does this beast look like? It says it had 10 horns and 7 heads, and on its horns were 10 diadem crowns. Now, this is a similar but a different picture from over in Revelation 12, the previous chapter, when it talked about the dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns. Over there, the crowns were on the heads. Here, the crowns are on the horns. And that difference is highly significant. And hopefully in a future episode, I'll be able to get to unraveling that. But if I did it now, it would kind of sidetrack us. But it has to do with the beast that we see described in Revelation chapter 17. And over there, it says the 7 heads are 7 mountains, and there are also 7 kings. And so we have some information that's given to us about what the 7 heads are representing, but the specific information that we're given when this beast is representing Satan, the crowns are on the 7 heads. But now we have in this verse a different picture. So this is separate. This is a distinct description. And in the end, what we find out is that this description of this beast is a distinct entity from Satan himself. That is why it says in the next verse that the dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority to rule. But is the normal view and interpretation that this beast is representing the Antichrist? Is that true? What we're going to see now is going to show that that is not true. This beast coming up out of the sea does not represent the man who is to be the Antichrist. It's associated with him, but it's not him specifically. Well, you might ask, how do I know that? Well, let me just show you here in verse 2. It says, "Now the beast that I saw was like a leopard, but his feet were like the feet of a bear, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth." Now, if you're familiar with the book of Daniel and the visions that Daniel had, you'll immediately recognize this. But in the order it's given here, the beast was like a leopard, then a bear, and then a lion. Now keep that in mind as we go over to Daniel chapter 7 verse 2. It says, Daniel explained, I was watching in my vision during the night as the four winds of the sky were stirring up the great sea. Well, that's interesting. But it says, then four large beasts came up from the sea, and they were different from one another. So John says he saw a beast come up out of the sea, and Daniel says he saw four beasts come up out of the sea. But what do we learn about these four beasts that Daniel saw? He says in verse 4, the first one was like a lion with eagle's wings. In verse 5, he says, then a second beast appeared like a bear. And then in verse 6, he says, after these things, as I was watching, another beast like a leopard appeared. Now, the first thing that you should take note of is that here the order is a lion, a bear, and a leopard. But in Revelation 13, the order is reversed. A leopard, a bear, and a lion. And I'll just say that I think that the reason Revelation 13:2 reverses the order is to highlight and emphasize not only that the kingdom of the Antichrist in the last days will exemplify all of the characteristics of those previous kingdoms, but also that the order in which they appear in Revelation 13, verse 2, speaks to us about which characteristics are going to be the most prominent concerning this kingdom. Now, we could take a whole lot of time going through Daniel's vision here, reading the whole chapter, which I would encourage you to do. However, it would make this episode too long, of course. But the general consensus of Daniel's vision of these four beasts coming up out of the sea is that these beasts represented empires, not necessarily individuals, but empires. And the first one that came up out of the sea represented the Babylonian Empire. The second beast that comes up out of the sea represented the Medo-Persian Empire, which came next. And the third beast that came up out of the sea, it looked like a leopard, represented the Grecian Empire. And we can talk about this one for just a minute here in verse 6, when he said, after these things, as I was watching, another beast like a leopard appeared, with four bird-like wings on its back. And more than likely, the bird-like wings represented the speed at which this particular beast moved. And then this beast had four heads, and ruling authority was given to it. And historically, we know that when Alexander the Great died, the Grecian Empire that he controlled was divided up among his four generals. Now, I'm not going to take the time in this episode to go through what Daniel said about the fourth beast that comes up out of the sea, but we'll do that another time. All I want you to see at this point in time is that the beasts in Daniel's vision that came up out of the sea were representing empires or nations. And what that does is it sets a precedent. So when we go over to Revelation chapter 13 and we see this beast coming up out of the sea, do we believe the common interpretation that this is talking about an individual? Because that doesn't fit the pattern that we see over in Daniel. And I'm saying what's most likely happening, and the correct way to understand this, is that when John saw a beast coming up out of the sea, that this is not talking about the Antichrist as an individual person, but about the empire or the nation that's going to emerge after the appearing of the Lord happens. And I guess what I'm saying is that the rebellion that begins to form immediately after Jesus appears at midpoint of the 7 years, as we saw over in Psalm chapter 2, why do the nations rage and the people imagine a vain thing? And they begin to form a coalition to come against the saints and to come against the Lord. That the focal point of that rebellion will centralize within this particular empire or nation that's coming up out of the sea and going to cause all of the chaos. and that this is not talking about the man who is going to rule that empire, but it's talking about the empire itself. And that interpretation correlates exactly with Daniel's vision of the beasts that come up out of the sea. Then when we get to verse 11 and we see the beast coming up out of the earth, now you can understand why that is the individual who is going to be the Antichrist, who is going to lead this last days empire. But then, even with that, there is a whole nother level to this. Because even though this particular beast coming up out of the sea represents the nation from which the Antichrist will emerge, there is the reality that the nation itself will have a divine being that's appointed over it. Because that's another pattern that we see over in Daniel. And it says over in Daniel chapter 10 that Daniel was praying, and an angel appeared to him and said that the prince of the kingdom of Persia was opposing me for 21 days, but Michael, one of the leading princes, came to help me because I was left there with the kings of Persia. That what we see in that story is that even though there are empires, there's earthly kingdoms and empires, that there are spiritual entities, heavenly beings who are appointed over those empires. And when it comes to the beast that's coming up out of the sea, representing the empire or the nation that's going to bring forth the Antichrist figure, that this is no different, and that there will be a divine being who's over that nation or empire, empowering the Antichrist. And then when we see later on in the book of Revelation, when it says that the beast and the false prophet were cast alive into the lake of fire, that it's talking about these two beasts that we see in Revelation 13. But it's not giving the idea that the nation that this first beast represents is going to be cast into the lake of fire, but the spiritual entity behind that empire that's empowering the Antichrist. And I know that this kind of gets a little bit complicated, but it all bears out with the scriptures, especially when we get over to Revelation chapter 17, and we see that the beast over there doesn't come up out of the sea, but comes up out of the abyss. And the biblical imagery of the sea and the abyss kind of overlap a little bit, but they have a little bit different character. The sea typically represents the chaos coming from the nations of the world, and the abyss and the imagery of the abyss is more related to the spiritual aspect of things, because the abyss is the same thing as the bottomless pit, which is where Satan will be thrown at the end of the 7 years. He will be chained up and put into the abyss, or the bottomless pit. And so here in Revelation 13, we have the imagery of the beast coming up out of the sea, which is more specific to talking about the empire or the nation that the Antichrist will emerge from. But this beast has the same exact description as the beast that comes up out of the abyss. But the reason for the difference is to highlight the spiritual aspect of the entity that's going to be behind the beast that comes up out of the sea, or the nation or empire of the Antichrist. Now, I know that that's a lot of information, but we'll continue to kind of expand on this in the next episode.